So today we're going to be talking about some of the challenges and some of the mistakes that are made when restoring the body shell of an MGA. Let's get going. So one of the first things you need to just understand when you jump into a restoration of one of these is that the body shells were still largely being handmade. They weren't just shallow stampings, all stamped out so all the fenders are exactly the same. The fenders, front and rear, are made up of multiple pieces that were welded together and hand finished by people, not machines. So there are slight variances from car to car to car and fender to fender. Now, not as big a variance as some of other cars that were out there, like the Alfa Romeo Giulietta Sprints from the same year. Those were completely handmade in small batches to where each batch would be pretty much the same, but batch to batch to batch could be quite different, with as much of a difference as from the headlight to the door as 3/4 of an inch. These weren't nearly that much of a difference, but there were some variances in the length. So it's long been my understanding, and I remember reading it somewhere, I just don't remember exactly where now, that when these were being built originally and all the bodies were being made, once the body shell itself was actually done and they were starting to fit the fenders, that they actually had the fenders hung up by length. So they would pick out a middle length fender, stick it on there, see how it lined up back here and up here. If it was a little short or a little long, then they would hang that fender back up and pick out either a slightly longer or slightly shorter fender to put on it to get all the gaps right. So that means when you're building one of these cars and you're putting together parts from multiple cars, or you have multiple cars that you're pulling parts from, where maybe one fender comes from this car and another one from that car, not everything's necessarily going to fit, and you're going to have to account for the possibility of spending extra time and effort either on your part or your body man's part, depending on who's doing that work, to make everything fit properly. So the car we are looking at here today is a 1956 1500 Roadster, and aside from some paint issues, is a very presentable car that pretty much anybody would actually be proud to own and pull up to a car show in. Now this car has had the body redone on it at some point, not a full restoration. And there is some issues in the body that somebody like me, who is a body man, can pick out that maybe a lot of other people wouldn't notice. And we're going to look at those things today. So now most of these issues that we're going to be looking at today really comes down to just the quality of the repair panels that have been available for the last 40 years, not being of the utmost highest quality, and the people installing them either not knowing exactly how the stuff's supposed to fit, or not being paid well enough to make the adjustments necessary to make them right. So before we even factor in the quality of the actual repair panels themselves, the MGA is actually a bit more difficult of a car to get all the details and everything lined up and looking right on than most people would actually realize. What I would say is the first and biggest single mistake that most people restoring these things do is, if the rockers are actually pretty rusty, what they do is they cut the rockers off and take the body off the chassis in two halves. Don't do that. My first MG I ever owned was an MGA that I drug out of the woods when I was 19 years old, and I did exactly that. That car never did get put back together. Actually, I saw it for sale at an auction a year or two ago, still in pieces. But you gotta understand that the whole side of this car, except for the rocker itself, is all adjustable. The doors, fenders, everything. The only anchor point you have for lining everything up is the rocker panel here. So if you take everything apart and you lose the alignment of the front and rear body sections, it makes it that much more difficult to get everything to look right. So you want to do all your rocker work before you take it off the chassis. Now, it can be a bit difficult to do that because the chassis is in the way to do all the welding, and it's in the way to do some of the work and all that stuff. But you just do the best you can, and anything you can't weld while it's on the chassis, you weld after you get it off the chassis. But that keeps the alignment of the front and rear body sections so that you can make everything else fit. So actually this area in here can actually be quite difficult to get correct and get everything to line up, especially if you're using all aftermarket panels or somebody's already been in here in the past and done some repair work and it wasn't the highest quality. The doorposts that are available or have been not great fitting. And actually the rockers don't quite fit right. None of this stuff fits right when you buy it. So you really have to work to get it all to look like it needs to look. There is a big sill panel, goes full length on the inside of here. The replacement panels, they don't quite fit right. They end up with an angle at the top that doesn't match the doorposts. And I've actually tried to put them in one where had very little rust in it, and they do not match up to the doorpost very good at all. Now the panels that have been available for years that have the gray primer on them, do not ever trust that primer. It can fall off quite easily, even with just using a blowgun. So always strip that off because they were not cleaned properly usually before the primer was put on, and it was really cheap primer. So now we're going to talk about the outer body repair panels, starting from the fender, working back. The front fender lower repair panel here that's commonly available. Now I do know there are some better stuff out there on the market now, but the stuff that's been available for 30, 40 years through places like Moss, Victoria British, and all those others that are reasonably priced, there's not enough shape in them right here. And if your body shop either doesn't have the tools or know-how to put that shape back in and shrink all this, or they take the approach that I'm not getting paid enough for this, or I don't really care, it leads to a repair to make everything work here that will show when you get underneath. That is super, super common and not correct. Now, same thing with the rocker here. There's not enough shape in them. They do not curve under far enough out of the box. And a lot of that comes back to the spring back within the pressings. And you have the same problem on MGBs. Even if you get the heritage panels, they're slightly open a little bit because of spring back. They're still using the original stampings, or original dies, but I think today's steel probably springs back a little bit more than what we had back then. Now I can tell this has had a lower repair panel on it because you reach back in here and you can feel the lip in the back here because this repair panel has a little jog in it, so you can put it up in behind here and then weld across, and that jog is there. Plus look here. See how this is here? This is a lot fatter. They didn't trim this up to make it look like it was all one piece. Now it should be relatively obvious in this shot one of the other issues that we find when you look at this gap and this gap here. Now in addition to that panel and this panel not having enough shape in it, the dog leg here never has enough shape in it either. This is a replacement one. We can feel it's been replaced from here down with a replacement panel. But not only does it not have enough shape this way, but it's too flat in this area here, and this corner doesn't even come close to fitting the door. And that's just how these panels have been forever now. So yeah, those panels don't fit very well. Plus, if you look at this, look how big of a gap there is. This panel is way too short. This should be pretty much even with the edge of this, and it's way far back. Plus, I think the rockers tend to be just a hair on the short side because you never quite can get them up here to where you get this looking quite like they should. Now, of course, this is built in the 50s. They didn't have panel gaps in the 50s like we're used to seeing today. But if you work with this, you can get it a little bit better. So here's another issue we have, both with the B's and the A's. See how this sticks out? That's because this is not shaped right. The MGB is the same way. Usually when the bottom of the door is sticking out like this, it's not because of the door, it's because none of these repair panels are fitting correctly. It's not curving out far enough. It's tipping in too soon because they couldn't get this shaped right. In this case here, we notice that all along the rocker it doesn't quite fit. Part of the issue here would be the door could be tipped in this way a little bit, the lower hinge pulled in. But you can't do that because of the fender. It's actually out a little bit here. That's because when they put this bottom panel in here, the fender's actually too long. So in order to get this to pull back in with the door, then this would be hanging out too low here. So that's part of doing the body work on all these things. And actually I think we got the same issue here. And that's why the door has to be out in order for this to line up here. So if they had trimmed a little bit more off of this and a little bit more off of this when they welded all this in, they could have brought the bottom of the door in just a little bit and had it line up the rocker better and still had it line up to the fenders on both ends. So now while we're talking about that shape here, one of the other issues that can happen is if you have a car that's been apart for a while or you've bought fenders that have been sitting around for a while, they can lose a lot of this shape. They can actually end up having less shape in here than they need, and they won't fit to the door here very well. It'll be too flat. And this here will open up and it'll actually physically become taller as well. And that leads to the problem we're just about to show you. So this is actually super common, as in more cars I see that have been repaired are like this than not. See this here? This line here? That is where the bottom of the fender and rocker are supposed to line up to. Not down here where they are. See, even that hole there, these holes, that's where the bolts are supposed to go through to hold the fenders. They've added a strip here to bring it down to match where the fenders and rocker were, rather than making the fenders and rocker fit the car like it's supposed to. Now, I've also seen them come down here where they did make the rocker fit and stay up here where it's supposed to be, but then when they get to the fender and it doesn't fit, they end up putting a wedge strip in that tapers all the way down. And that is absolutely not right either. This line from the fender all the way back across should be straight. It shouldn't come at any kind of angles or taper down or anything. Now, one other thing that's usually wrong on these cars that is correct on this one is most people forget to put this strip on. This is aluminum strip that covers all the screws up. And yes, it is supposed to be body color. So another really common problem area is the fitment of the grille into the nose of the car here. Now, a lot of the aftermarket grills that were available for many years didn't actually fit all that well. Now, we do have some grills available today that do fit pretty darn well. But a lot of these cars got backed into and had damage across the front here. So they end up needing work to make the grill fit correctly. And one of the common mistakes people make, I've heard way too many times, both with A's and even B's too, is not having the grill with the car while the bodywork's getting done. It is of the utmost importance to have the grill with the car through all stages of bodywork. And not just a grill, the one that's going to be in it once it's painted. So don't fit it to the original grill, and then go buy a new one. It is very, very sensitive to how well it fits around here. It has to be darn near perfect for this welting to stay in place all the way around, or it'll just pull out. Very common issue. So now on to the paint issues I said this car has. Now, I am not showing these paint issues to say that there's anything wrong with this car in particular. This is just an informational thing. This guy paid the right price for this car with these issues. He is enjoying the car, and it is actually a really good car. So, you see the cracking here. We've got that in several places on the car. This being an older paint job, and the way a lot of painters work and have worked for many years, is they over-rely on using the high build primers to make everything look really nice. And this was probably done with the old lacquer-based primers, you know, that were still available 20, 30 years ago. And putting them on really heavy can cause cracking later. And I actually believe that this car was not stripped down to the bare metal, which exacerbates that problem. The reason why I think that is we have stuff like this in the car, which I don't know how well you can see that, but see all this look here? That is not in the paint. That is in the base underneath the paint. And the paint has shrunk down into it over time. So the paint was underneath here was damaged. It was cracked and crazed, probably from the sun, weathered. And when you don't strip the paint off and you try to paint over that and just seal it, this is what can happen. Especially back when this thing probably was painted. It was, you know, the products that we had for sealers was like the old Valvoline, which is what was still being used when I started painting. That stuff wouldn't work nearly as well as today's urethane-based stuff. But I personally would not trust the urethane-based stuff to permanently cover this up. I would always strip the paint down to bare metal when it's that beat to begin with. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the possible mistakes and pitfalls of doing one of these. It's just some of the most common stuff that I see coming through my shop. So I thought this, since I had this car in here, it would make a good opportunity to do this.